Welcome to Boxing During Dinner. Armando Alvarez, David Barry, and Victor Bermudez. And the fourth person here who you haven't met yet is Matthew Aguilar from the El Paso Times, a longtime boxing writer. He's covered a who's who of boxing champions. Matt, welcome to Boxing During Dinner.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I actually haven't had dinner yet, but I was hoping you guys would give me some.
Oh man, we're off to a pretty bad start.
Right? And we same thing happened with Mike Coppinger. We owe him like some tiramisu for a bet we made. But in a non-COVID world, we'd all be in a restaurant. You'd probably be hanging out in Miami just because it's Miami. It's a thing to do.
Yep.
But since it's Boxing During Dinner, I got to ask you. You were just at the Ugas Pacquiao fight in Vegas. When you're out in Vegas covering fights, what's your go-to place to eat a good dinner?
Woo! Wow, you start off with a tough one. I mean, at my age, I'll take Luby's, right? I'll take like a cafeteria or something. But no, any buffet. You know what? I'll take any buffet. I mean, we went to the buffet in the Cosmo. My wife joined me, and hey, it was $50 a head. But hey, what the heck? We did okay.
In Vegas.
I probably gained a good 10 pounds. I'm well beyond my fighting weight at this point. But hey, you know what? It was well worth it. It was good. Those lobster tails were pretty good.
And Matt, so Ugas versus Pacquiao, or when it started, it was Pacquiao Ugas, right? But like we mentioned before we got on air, you have two Cuban Americans. You got an honorary Cuban there in David. So we were Team Ugas, even though we're not supposed to really cheer. But what the hell, I'm not on TV calling the fight, right? But
right.
Two out of the three did pick Ugas, even though David picked Pacquiao, but he still thought Ugas had a good shot at winning. To me, he fought the perfect fight. He came out, he jabbed, he did what he had to do to beat Manny Pacquiao. Manny showed flashes of Manny, the jumping around, the punches and bunches. But eventually it got to the point, you saw Manny kind of wearing down. He didn't have many answers for Ugas. Being there at the T-Mobile Arena, what did you see in this fight? Was it more Ugas's game plan? Was it a fading Pacquiao at 42, thinking about running for president of the Philippines, or was it just a combination of both?
I think after 7 rounds, Pacquiao looked okay. I mean, I think he was a little awkward at times. I think a lot of it could have been, the change of opponent, the change of stances. But I think what kind of told the story in terms of his decline, I think, is the last 4 rounds or so. He just faded. He just wasn't the same guy. He couldn't, you could tell he was having a hard time mustering, the ability to kind of connect on punches. He was having trouble with distance. His legs didn't seem to be there. Even when he punched and when he landed, it didn't seem to have the same effect. He had no leverage, and something about Ugas and his ability to control, not only control the distance, but he was long and rangy, and he prevented Pacquiao from getting any kind of momentum going, and his big shouldered and his leverage kind of seemed to he stumbled a few times. How many times have you really seen Manny Pacquiao stumble, and kind of and just miss and just look kind of sloppy, and I mean, that may very well be because of the last minute change of opponent. I think it was a little more, especially late. He didn't have any answers. He didn't really know how to. He seemed lost a little bit, and afterwards, I did. There've been some comments today from Manny about it was like a basic opponent or something like that. But you know what? Those are the hardest ones to fight. The ones that are so technically sound, that they know what they're doing and where they are and at all times. And I think Manny I think he just had I think didn't matter how many times they fight, Ugas' style is going to give him problems. That said, I think he lost a little bit. And, a lot of people on Twitter are I said something like, had been Spence in there, it'd been real ugly.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people took exception to that. But I stand by it. I mean, I think, you know, Spence is just a harder puncher. It's a different style of fighter. You know, but he's a little faster and he's a harder puncher. Not that he's necessarily that much better than Ugas, who showed a ton of skill. It's just a different kind of fighter, and I think Pacquiao would have taken a lot of punishment in the process of, you know, probably losing either a late knockout or a very wide decision.
David?
Oh, sorry. I thought Armando was frozen there for a second. You know,
That's what
I tend to think that I believe Manny Pacquiao, and I told Armando this after the fight, would have beaten probably still another 5 or 6 of the top 10 welterweights on the planet that night. I actually didn't see a diminished Pacquiao. I saw a fighter who was outfought. I think you talked about Ugas being all wrong for Pacquiao, and then of course hindsight being what it is. I didn't think the fight would go that way, but it did. And I had the sense that even in the rounds that Pacquiao was winning, that Ugas was actually dictating the pace of the fight. Pacquiao was simply, the rounds he was winning on volume and activity and trying to set things up. But he really struck me as a fighter who had no game plan. If you had told, you know, fans going in that this is, you know, arguably one of the 5 to 10 greatest fighters who's ever fought, you wouldn't have believed it, because I don't think Pacquiao looked as diminished as a lot of people want to easily write it off with as his age. I think Yordenis Ugas, and let's call it what it was. And in a lot of ways, it does mirror an orthodox Errol Spence, perhaps without, you know, the power, but certainly the same strength, I think, is a basic fighter. Basic, not in a bad word, but a fundamental fighter. Somebody who, I mean, you can look, and any time Pacquiao threw a jab or a lead left, he was countered almost every single time. I think Ugas landed over 60% of his, or close to 60% of his power shots in this fight.
It was like Tim Duncan.
Yes, exactly. The big fundamental, right? That's exactly what Ugas was. And I don't think that, you know, that Pacquiao even 5 years ago would have maybe beaten the Yordenis Ugas who has become who he has become. And I think Pacquiao should walk away. Frankly, I think after the Thurman fight, you don't get a better send-off than that. But no fighter, I mean, there's very few who ever leave at the right time. It's almost always one fight too late. And regrettably, I think Pacquiao probably saw enough in his own performance to believe that he can go out and do it against somebody else. And regrettably, he might be right. But I think Yordenis Ugas is as qualified at the top of that weight class as Terence Crawford and Errol Spence at this point. I'm not saying he beats those guys. I'm saying he's as qualified. I think he beat Sean Porter. I know the judges said that he beat Manny Pacquiao, and he clearly did. And you can argue that he has as good of a resume of the welterweight title holders as anybody else does. Certainly at this point has usurped Terence Crawford, which would have sounded insane even just a couple of weeks ago. But here we are.
Look, guys, I really do think Pacquiao is done. I thought so going into it. I thought the 2-year layoff was going to be an issue. I thought the late change in opponent was going to be an issue. Like I told you guys last week, 42 years old. It's just, I think Father Time came calling. The only one that's defeated Father Time again is Tom Brady, and it's over. Unfortunately,
yeah, but that was coming. He's coming for him. Father Time's coming for him.
Yeah, God, we hope so, man.
When he's 63.
Now that he's out of the AFC East, it doesn't really matter to me. But
you're happy about that.
But getting back to Pacquiao, and I know it'll sound ridiculous. I do have proof from the people that I was watching the fight with. I thought 90 seconds into the fight, I saw something from Pacquiao that was very telling, and it was just the work rate seemed to drop right at the 90 seconds. With 1 minute 30 left in that first round, it just was all Ugas for the rest of that round. And it's not typical of Manny Pacquiao. If Manny Pacquiao does lose rounds, it's because he got caught, not because of inactivity. And I just thought he wasn't as active as we're used to seeing Manny Pacquiao. And Ugas, Cuban boxers don't tend to be as busy as Ugas normally was. And I thought that would be the issue with Ugas and Manny Pacquiao. Manny Pacquiao tends to be this very active fighter. And it just didn't seem like there was there. His legs weren't there. And I disagree with David. I don't think he can beat some of the... There are some welterweights, maybe from the 6th to the 10th welterweight down. Maybe Pacquiao can hang with those guys. But I've mentioned it numerous times before. I think Virgil Ortiz knocks him out. If not, keeps him into retirement. Terrence Crawford, I don't see how he'd be able to hang with Terrence. And I think Errol Spence is the best welterweight in the division now. So
Boots in is as well.
And Ugas already beat him. So those are 5 guys right there that I just don't think. I think Pacquiao's done, and there's nothing to be upset about. I mean, one of the greatest of all time, but he just didn't look the part. And I don't think it's the last minute change. I think Errol Spence would have done something way worse than what Ugas did, and probably won that by knockout.
No, and a couple of things on Pacquiao, Matt, because I agree with you. I think if he would have fought Spence, it would have ended ugly. I mean, I don't know if it would have ended Julio Ceja ugly, but it would have ended pretty ugly. And
great reference, by the way. Thank you.
He's because
great fight, by the way.
Yeah,
amazing fight of the night. Better than that Ortiz Guerrero fight.
Oh, good. God.
but yeah, Spence is a hard hitter. I think he would have knocked Pacquiao out. But you know, it something rubbed me the wrong way with Pacquiao today with those comments, about Ugas, because Pacquiao's always been, the smiling champion. I remember his face off with Mosley when I was in Vegas. They couldn't contain their laughter as they looked at each other. I mean, it was pretty funny to see. And for him to lose and then say like, oh, he's probably one of the easiest opponents that I face, and that happened. It's like why? Why at this point? You're 42. You're like David said, he could have had this great send off beating Keith Thurman, who, by the way, amazing doing TV for this pay-per-view with Fox. But Matt, do you think Pacquiao maybe, I don't know, like, I know losing sucks, but you're about to end your career, and you're making comments like that, about Yordenis Ugas, instead of just like tipping your hat and saying, great fight, I'm out, or let's do a rematch?
Look, Manny Pacquiao was a competitive athlete. Okay, competitive athletes have egos, and they are driven human beings, and you can't just turn that on and off. I think it is, it's just part of his chemistry, part of his makeup. And after a couple of days of reflection, after a serious disappointment, I mean, I think he probably watched the tape and said, how did I lose to this guy? Just because, not anything against Ugas, but like we were saying, he's kind of a basic fighter. Nothing. I mean, to me, that's calling someone fundamental is high praise. All right. But in his mind, he probably went back and watched the tape and said, with a full training camp with this guy, I know I can beat him. I can.
Now, do you think it's kind of like, like we were talking about Brady and, defeating Father Time, that sometimes it's like the old athlete who sits there and they're like, oh, I could beat these 20-year-olds in basketball.
Yep.
And then you go out there and you get your ass kicked and you're like, how did I lose to them? It's like, you're 42, guy.
That's why you have fighters coming out of retirement at 45 and 50, because they think they could. Look at De La Hoya. He fights next week or something.
September 11th.
Last we saw, I covered Pacquiao and De La Hoya. Oof. That was one of the worst butt kickings I've ever seen in my life that I've ever covered. And I mean, nobody has looked more defeated than Oscar De La Hoya did that night. Yeah. And here he is, 12 years later, and he's going to go in the ring again. Not good. But my point is that those competitive fires never extinguish with these fighters. I mean, on one hand, we ask them to turn in these unbelievable performances that we all hail, on the other end, we expect them to just accept defeat, just because it happened. I mean, that's not the way they're built. It's not the way they're built. I think Manny Pacquiao, you don't become an 8-time or an 8-division world champion, by accepting defeat. I mean, he doesn't want to accept it. After I saw the comments today, I kind of felt like, guess what? There's probably going to be a rematch. And guess what? It'll probably be pretty big. People are going to want to watch it. Yep. And all of us are going to watch it. And
yes, we will.
Competitive athletes, can't just turn it on and off. Even at 42, even at 52, even at 62, these guys still want, I mean, I think I remember one time, I think Thomas Hearns challenged Marvin Hagler at like the Hall of Fame ceremony or something, like, I mean, these guys were in their 60s. I mean, you can't just turn it on and off. That's the way they're built.
And it's crazy to even mention that phrase 8th division champion, but a guy that's definitely not 42. He's still in the prime of his career. He's the biggest draw in boxing right now is Canelo Alvarez. And speaking of taking crap,
I thought you were going to say Jake Paul. Sorry,
Jake Paul.
I did too.
That's what I would have said.
I did too. You want to talk about ordering fights? I'm watching on Sunday.
Oh,
I'll see you there.
I'm watching as well. But one guy who
I can't tell if you guys are kidding or not.
No, we're not kidding. We're gonna watch.
I'm not.
We'll watch.
I'm interviewing Jake Paul tomorrow, so no, I'm not.
Let's put a pin in this. I think we'll have a good sidebar on this, but let's talk where he's really going.
Exactly, but Matt got a lot of crap on Twitter about Canelo Alvarez, right? Canelo Alvarez is the biggest draw in boxing. He's one of the greatest Mexican champs of all time. But Matt, you mentioned the other day it was the anniversary of the death of Salvador Sanchez, and you said how he is probably the best Mexican fighter of all time. You look at his resume. I was telling someone, I mean, I don't even know how old I was. I was very, very young, so I don't really remember watching the fight. But when he beat Wilfredo Gomez, I mean, I know Puerto Rican men who watched the fight that night who tell me that is the saddest day of my entire life. When Wilfredo Gomez, who was one of the greats of all time, lost to Salvador Sanchez in a pretty one-sided fight. Salvador Sanchez won the big fights. Julio Cesar Chavez won the big fights. He beat Meldrick Taylor, even though there was 2 seconds left. He beat Jose Luis Ramirez. He beat El Chapo Rosario very convincingly. To me, the biggest fights of Canelo's career has been Triple G and Floyd Mayweather Jr. Mayweather beat him. I thought Triple G beat him twice, at least if you want to say the first fight. So, Matt, why are you getting so much crap from people? If to me, you're speaking the truth. Chavez and Salvador Sanchez are above Canelo.
Yeah, I think, it's a I think anytime, it's not just now. I was about to date myself and say, these kids today, whatever. But anytime if someone does well contemporary, now, that person is always going to be the greatest fighter ever, right? It happened with Floyd. It's happening with Canelo. Everybody, whoever's active now is always going to be, they're the best, and that's what people are watching right now. And that's what young people are watching. And those are most of the people that are, arguing with me in terms of who is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. But my only argument was just that it's not just names on a resume, right? It's also what you do with the names on the resume. And you look at Chavez, right? He had been the junior lightweight champion for about 4 years, moved up to fight Rosario. And, I was scared for Chavez's life at the time. Seriously. Rosario had just beat the living crap out of Livingstone Bramble, who at the time was the best lightweight in the world. Livingstone Bramble was no joke. Rosario went in there and destroyed him in 2 rounds. Just absolutely annihilated him. And then here's Chavez moving up from 130 to 135 to fight who is probably at the time, other than Mike Tyson, the hardest puncher in boxing. Just relentless. And in his prime, it appeared. And Chavez didn't just beat him. He took him apart meticulously, round by round by round. And by the end of it, Rosario he looked like he'd been hit by a Mack truck. Okay. And you look at Sanchez. Again, I was kind of scared for Sanchez's life. Wilfredo Gomez at the time was the best pound-for-pound fighter in boxing.
Yeah.
Right? He was 32-0 with 32 knockouts. Okay? Sanchez was not known as a heavy puncher. He was a volume puncher, but he was not known as somebody who was going to knock you out flat. He wasn't a big puncher. So when Gomez moved up to fight him, I thought, whew, everybody thought that it was a bit of a, I think almost everybody, I don't remember the odds, but I think it might have been about even, but a lot of people really thought Gomez was going to knock him out. Sanchez, like Chavez against Rosario, didn't just beat him. He destroyed him. He took him apart. He just, round by round, he dropped him in the first round and then just took him apart from there. So my argument is simply this. When those guys were faced with their biggest opponents on the biggest stage and the biggest fight of their life, they didn't just outpoint somebody. They didn't just barely escape with a disputed decision. They were emphatic. They knocked their guy out, and they knocked him out impressively. Okay? That's my point. To me, that's the difference between good and great. When you're faced with your biggest opponent, no matter what the era, and you leave no doubt. You destroy them. That's what Chavez did against Rosario. That's what Sanchez did against Gomez. And, if Canelo were to go and fight even now, if he were to beat Golovkin like that, even now, I would be like, okay, that's pretty impressive. But as of now, a couple of very disputed decisions. I covered the first fight. I had Golovkin winning handily. I didn't think it was. When I heard the decision, I almost stopped covering boxing because I thought it was outrageous. It was an outrageous decision. Okay, and then the rematch, much closer, right? Much closer. I can see it going Canelo's way. I still had Triple G winning by a couple points. Yep. I don't think Triple G fought a good fight. He didn't go to the body like he probably should have. So fine. I'll give you that one. I don't think he won. I don't think Canelo did enough to win, but fine. At best, it's 1-1. Okay, so
let me hop in there because I was agreeing with you up to a certain point when you said the difference between good and great fighters. So in your opinion, Canelo's not a great fighter?
I think it kind of remains to be seen in my book. I don't have any problem with people who say that he's in the top 10 of the great Mexican fighters. Okay, bottom half, sure, but is he greater than Marquez? I don't know. I don't know that he is. You can even show someone who, a dear fighter to me, a guy named Pepino Cuevas, who made 11 defenses of the WBA welterweight title in 4 years, broke jaws, youngest welterweight champion.
And there were only ever. 2 belts at that time, so that was.
And there were only 2 belts at that time. That's exactly right. And I don't even put him in the top 10. I don't even put him in the top 10. So all I'm saying is the argument between good and great, that's a tough one. And I wouldn't have an argument with anybody that said that Canelo is great. When I put him as great, I think that remains to be seen. I also wouldn't have a problem with somebody who put Canelo in the top 10. Top 5, I don't think he's done enough. And the guys that he's fought so far, it seems like he's always had a bit of an advantage. His biggest wins, Cotto, he was bigger. Cotto's a natural junior welterweight, right? Austin Trout, that was disputed. Erislandy Lara, that was disputed. I was ringside for that one. I scored it a draw. So I guess my only point is that, in order to be great, I think you need to win emphatically, and I don't know that Canelo has. That's my. By the way,
there's nothing wrong with being one of the 10 best Mexican fighters of all time, right?
Right.
And I think people lose the context of the value. That, 2 things can be true. You may not be the best Mexican fighter of all time. You can also be a great fighter. Those things can both exist at the same time. Canelo Alvarez is a great fighter. Those who believe that he's the best current pound-for-pound fighter on earth, I don't necessarily disagree with. I think
I believe that. Yeah.
But exactly to your broader point, the biggest scalp on Canelo's resume, and maybe this is going to sound outlandish, is Callum Smith. He was a unified titleist when he fought him at a weight class that he legitimately belonged in. Outside of that, to your broader point, yes, he's got a bunch of big names on his resume, but there's an asterisk next to most of them. And again, that doesn't mean that Canelo has not deserved the wins that he's gotten in most of those fights, perhaps. but to your point, not convincingly. And that doesn't mean you're not a fan of Canelo Alvarez. That doesn't define any less what the greatness of Canelo Alvarez is. It just places it in the appropriate context, and he hasn't done it yet.
I'm smiling because I'm looking at Victor. Victor's just dying to jump in.
It's a lot to take in, so I'm just like processing
look.
everything.
I've got to be your Stephen A, man. If I don't throw out some hyperbole,
I know. And to a certain extent, I do agree with you guys. I understand it. I really do. And I remember after the Miguel Cotto fight, I looked at my talent when we were in Vegas. I will never forget being in the airport, and I said, this man will become the greatest Mexican fighter of all time at some point. I thought the workload would continue. I thought the opponents would continue. I thought he'd continue winning in dominating fashion. It didn't happen. As you mentioned, he struggled. I do agree. I think there's rounds that Canelo just disappears for the most part. 7, 8, 9. He wins the championship rounds like a champion's supposed to, but there's still rounds that you look at him and you're like, what are you doing? Daniel Jacobs is a perfect example.
Yeah.
But at what point do we give him credit for being the only Mexican to win in so many divisions or aligning himself with 4 other greats? At what point, when he does win in November, do we give him credit for what he accomplished? Because no other Mexican has done that. Mm-hmm. So at what point do we start giving him credit for the stuff that no other Mexican has accomplished? There's not too many that have gone up to 175 and done what he did. There's not too many that have gone to as many divisions as he's done, and he continues to do so. And again, his resume is not that bad. Because if we want, and I've mentioned this numerous times, if we want to start comparing resumes, let's take a look at Chavez's resume. Because Chavez was fighting bums when he was pound for pound king. And granted, yes, he was fighting every 2 months, every 6 weeks. But who was the opposition? If Canelo does that today, what would you guys think of him then?
Wait,
I think we need to correct the record here. I mean, I think Chavez would fight 6 or 7 times a year, and some of those fights would be non-title fights in Mexico for charity. A lot of times, he would fight. Later, even in his prime, Chavez he didn't spend a whole lot of time in the gym. His training was fighting. So he would keep in shape and stay sharp against fighters in Mexico. And then he'd come back.
If Canelo was doing that, if Canelo did that against the same opposition, what would the public think of him now?
Would he be fighting Meldrick Taylor? If he was fighting Meldrick Taylor, if he was doing all that and fighting Triple G,
if you're going to throw me the big names, that Chavez fought, granted. But if we study the 89-0, there's a bunch of guys in there that should not have been in the same ring with Chavez.
Well, I mean, it depends on who you're talking. You're talking championship fights.
I'm just talking in general.
That's not true. He fought. If you look at his record, I mean, he fought the best of 3 divisions. He fought the best, and around the best of 3 divisions, he fought non-title fights.
How about the fact that he started his career 10-0, and the first 10 fights were against guys making their pro debut?
Well, but Canelo probably had a similar start to his career too. I think
they all do, but we wanted.
But I mean, look, there's even a and I mean, this is not a dispute. This happened. Chavez lost a fight in Mexico early on in his career, and they got it reversed later on. It was like a technical decision. They awarded the other guy the win, and Chavez ended up with the win. Typical boxing shenanigans. So, you know what? I'm
Mexican boxing shenanigans. I'm way familiar with those.
Probably, WBC, right? I mean, he was the WBC's favorite son. He made him money. But my point being, I mean, when you fight 100 fights or whatever he fought, it's going to be dotted with guys who don't belong in the same ring with him. But the whole point back then was not to, the point was for him to stay sharp, and he fought often because that's what Mexican fighters did back then. You look at Jose Luis Ramirez, who fought Rosario twice. He had like over 100 fights. That's the way Mexican fighters did it. They fought a bunch of non-title fights at home, and then they fought the championship fights in America or, abroad or wherever. But, it wasn't to pad the record. No one cared about. Now, they obviously, once Chavez started winning a lot of fights and going undefeated, then that one loss in Mexico became more important, right? And they tried to cover it up a little more. But the point wasn't to pad records necessarily. The point was to stay sharp and to whatever it is, fight in front of their fans in Mexico.
I'm of the opinion.
It was the pad. I don't think it was the pad, Armando. I don't at all. I just think he was that guy. He liked to fight, and I do believe that he just wanted to stay active. My issue with that is if Canelo does the same thing today, we will look down on him and be like, no, because I hear it. I hear my Mexican talent. When I travel to the fights, I went to Los Angeles for their workout, and there's Mexicans with Mexican flags saying Mexico para Triple G. And I don't understand where that's coming from, because this guy's only represented you guys to the highest there is in the sport of boxing. But it's just, if he was doing the same thing that fighters were doing back then, just fighting whoever to stay busy, I think we would be even knocking him down even further than what we do now.
I think Canelo did this year here in Miami against I want to always call him like Avril Lavigne.
Did the WBC do that?
Jilderim, but
I have him in the WBC. The WBC ordered that fight, and
but I have no issues with that though.
Victor, let me ask you a quick question. Do you think Canelo's being dictated to by the WBC?
No, I
seriously?
not at all. He's thrown that in Mauricio's face before. But if you're trying to accomplish something no Mexican fighter has ever done, and the WBC orders that fight, and why they ordered it, that's Russian stuff and money, and that goes beyond just.
I had no issue with him fighting Jilderim. I mean, I like fighters to remain active. When I grew up, and by the way, a nice big shout out to Brad Jacobs and Tuesday Night Fights, which came up on Twitter with Matt today. That's the era I grew up in. I like activity. I hate this era of, you fight once or twice a year. I hate it. I'd rather see Canelo fight Jilderim, today, and then plant in November than not see him fight at all.
And he tried doing that. He wanted to fight 4 times this year, but we just continue to just knock him.
Okay, Victor, let me ask you this question. Okay, simple question. Why didn't he fight Triple G for a 3rd time? What's the answer to that question?
That I do.
Okay, here's the thing. He's a champion.
Yep.
He's available, and it answers questions. But yet,
okay, and I hate to answer a question with a question. I do, and so I'll answer your question. I don't know. He should have. My question to you, my rebuttal would be, after I've answered your question, because I don't want to do that question for question. Why didn't Triple G ever go up or down? Why won't he fight him at 168? Why didn't he fight Andre Ward? Why did he move down? Why doesn't he fight the Charlos? Why does Triple G always decide to stay at 160?
Look. Triple G has been trying to fight Canelo for about 2 years now. It's the whole reason that the Zone signed him. Yeah. They wanted that fight for September of 2019. And Canelo didn't want to fight him. And my theory is that he doesn't want to fight a big puncher. Okay, the guys he's fighting lately, Saunders, Callum Smith, Plant's coming up. Great fight, good fighters, no doubt about that. But when is he going to fight a dangerous puncher again? And that's, to me, it seemed like he's ducking him a little bit. And it's been going on for a long time.
That's fair.
There's really no reason, in my opinion, just my could be ridiculous opinion. There's no reason why he can't be fighting Triple G right now. I don't know what the reason is. He's available.
Triple G fight him at 168?
I'm sure. I think Triple G would fight him at 250 pounds.
Yeah,
I mean,
at this point, Triple G's desperate at this point, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's now.
I mean,
now.
He wants it.
Coexistence right now. He wants to fight Canelo.
And so to answer your bigger question, Victor, is that would Canelo be getting, criticized if he were fighting a bunch of fights down in Mexico? He would if he were fighting championship fights against guys like Avril Lavigne.
Yes.
Great.
He's not going to get criticized if he's fighting Triple G. That's my point. Chavez, in between all of the fights in Mexico against guys making their pro debut, or worse, he was fighting Melder Taylor, Rosario, Roger Mayweather, Pernell Whitaker. He was fighting the best of the best of the best. Rocky Lockridge, Juan Laporte. I mean, the list goes on and on. So if Canelo's fighting the best of the best in between all of his non-title fights, I don't think anybody would have any problem.
And since we're talking Chavez, before we move on to the beloved WBA, of course I got to mention, big fights, mega fights, and putting in a massive performance. My favorite fighter of all time, Pernell Whitaker.
Yep.
Did that to Chavez, got a draw, and what till this day is the worst decision I've ever seen in my life. But I had to mention Sweet Pea, rest in peace. We love you.
Yeah.
Yep.
But the WBA today finally announces changes. Like if they're doing us a big favor, instead of one champion, they have, as we all know, the super champion, the regular champion, the interim champion. Interim means in the meantime, while the real champion is hurt or something. You don't have an interim champion while you have two effing champions already. Like idiot.
Yes, you do if you're the WBA.
If you're the WBA. And they have a gold champion. And then, oh God, I tried to make sense of this today, and I swear, like my day almost got ruined. Because I was like, okay, so if Pacquiao and Ugas don't fight, again, who does Ugas fight? If the WBA orders the number one rated WBA challenger to fight, I go and look and I see interim champion Jamal James. I see gold champion Virgil Ortiz, and then I see a list of, and I'm like, okay, so does he fight James? Does he fight Ortiz? Does the gold champion not get to be the number one? I don't know. It just doesn't make any fucking sense. So yes, we could curse on the show. So especially when talking about the WBA, it doesn't make any sense at all. So now they announce, okay, so we're not going to remove the super champion, but this gold champion is kind of like a NIBF or USBA. No, you guys suck. Like, I think every champion should get the WBA belt, throw it in the garbage, forget about it. But you know that won't happen.
This is like creating your own problem and then expecting like credit for the solution. It's just like
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the WBA, it's exactly to your point, they can legitimately fuck themselves. I think that it's foolish that we're having this conversation. Look, is it a step in the right direction? Yes. That doesn't mean that it needs to be celebrated. It means that there should be one. There shouldn't even be 4 sanctioning bodies, period. But there should certainly, if they're going to be, only be one champion per body, period. I mean, the fact that that Fox even had to have a graphic to acknowledge Jamal James as a title holder to clarify the welterweight picture was probably startling to someone who was like, oh, I've heard of Manny Pacquiao. Let me watch that. That makes no fucking sense. So there's what, 5 champions in the weight class and then a gold champion. I think we also discovered that the WBO has a global champion and a world champion, which is a distinction that I don't think anyone's been able to clarify for me. Is the globe better than the world? That's a question I haven't really been able to clarify.
Wait till someone comes out with that universe belt.
Oh, geez.
But
that'll solve things.
I do like when BJ Saunders fights for the Mestizo title. That's always fun.
I thought that was fantastic. I didn't want BJ Saunders to beat Canelo, but the only reason I did want him to win is to really upset the apple cart and be the first WBC Mestizo champion at 168. It just didn't happen.
and Victor, so the WBA, as Matt could see, right, we keep the show pretty clean, but the WBA just brings it out in us, man. It's then F-bombs all over the place.
Look, I wish, and I'm not a big fan of the monopoly that Dana White has going and the way he treats his fighters and the money MMA fighters make, but I am jealous of the UFC in that sense that, mandatories fight the champion, and there's one belt, and you're gonna get the best fighting the best. And I wish boxing would take that page out of UFC and implement it in what it is, a sport. But I think there's way too many belts. I wish, I grew up on that green belt, and I just don't understand when or how it got out of hand. Like, what do we need 4 titles per division for? And then how many divisions are there? And then why are there 40 something WBA belts? Like, it makes no sense. And I think that's what hurts the sport of boxing more than, staying inactive or just taking tune-ups in between championship fights. I think the sport does it to themselves by having 4 belts, interim belts, gold belts, super belts, diamond belts. It makes absolutely no sense.
And Matt, going back to, we were talking about Tuesday night fights briefly. I enjoyed those USBA and NABF title fights. And I know that title meant a stepping stone for fighters, when we saw Jesse James Hughes and a lot of the fighters back then. But when did it get to where we are? Because I felt like not that long ago it was, WBA, IBF, WBC, and that's the way it went, right? Before that, obviously, there was less and less. And then, WBO comes into the mix. I remember Francesco Damiani being the WBO champ and then losing it to Ray Mercer. And it still wasn't it's just the WBO. Now they're in the mix. Oh, now in the 4 belt era. And then you just have like David was saying, the global belt, this belt, the regular belt. When did it get out of control? And what can be done aside from just the fighters saying is that the fighters love holding that belt? But do you think there'll ever be a point that these fighters are no, I just want to be the champ, not a champ?
Well, to answer your first question, this has been happening for as long as I've been a boxing fan. Okay, so we're talking 40 plus years. People were having these discussions in 1980 when Matthew Saad Muhammad wasn't fighting Eddie Mustafa Muhammad, the WBA and WBC light heavyweight champions. Even back then, people were like, why do we have to have 2 belts? Why can't we just have 1 belt? That's where it all started.
That's a very good question.
Right? That's the champion of the world is the champion of the world. And what happened is these sanctioning bodies discovered that once their championship belts were paraded on television, on HBO, ABC, NBC, when whoever was televised at the fight, that these fighters became enamored with these belts. And so they would pay these sanction fees, in order to be be represented by this organization, which I've always found absolutely ridiculous. Does, the New England Patriots pay the NFL, right? Or, the Tampa Bay Bucks pay the NFL a fee in order to be their NFL champion? No, it doesn't. That's where it goes wrong right there. There was supposed to be 1 champion per division. They discovered that people would pay for the fighters. They would take advantage of the fighters. The fighters would pay this money for these belts. So whoa, they'll pay for these belts. So let's make more belts. And now they're making all kinds of crazy belts.
And
right?
Try explaining that to the casual fan to say, use the NFL analogy, right? The Patriots win the NFC East, the AFC East, right? But they're not going to play the winner of the AFC South.
Right.
They're
going to go ahead and play the Falcons.
Yeah, right, exactly. The Falcons, who, by the way, are 3rd in their own division. They didn't even make it to win the NFC. It doesn't compute. They're calling themselves world champion at the same time.
That's correct. So as long as boxing has this system, this corrupt system of 3 and 4, it was bad with 2 belts. Now it's double bad with 4 belts. As long as this system exists, these troubles will continue to plague the sport, and it will never correct itself. Victor's point of UFC is the only way that boxing is going to get out of this mess. It needs to be some sort of whether you like it or not. It's got to be something that is contained and makes some sense. And UFC has done well with that. And I think it's time for boxing to completely these fighters, managers, whatever, promoters need to stop paying these sanction fees to these sanctioning bodies. And you stop doing that, they will go away. They will go away. They won't have any place. How are they going to exist? if nobody's paying them money to exist.
Man,
So
I remember when I found out, and sorry to interrupt you, but I remember finding out that fighters actually had to pay for the title. And like, I was that emoji where your head explodes.
Yep.
And I didn't
It's crazy.
know, I didn't know until recently, like maybe just a few weeks ago when the WA pulled the whole shenanigan. You have to pay $10,000 to file a complaint just to have it be heard.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
That is
Michael
even more
Fox, you're
ridiculous.
talking about-
The fact,
Yep,
that's
Michael
just
Fox.
nuts. Like
They have
on top of
all
that,
of-
I have to pay you to wear your belt, and then if I don't like the result, I have to pay you even more money just to review the result.
Yep.
Like,
So stop paying them money at all. And what they need is, a group of well-respected boxing enthusiasts to run the sport. It doesn't have to be the government necessarily. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be, a federal type of thing. It just needs to be somebody who, hey, it could be all of us, right? And
I like us. I think we're up to the task.
Sign me up.
I mean, I think the point is, you need to stop paying a bunch of crooks to run your sport, right?
Absolutely.
If you're paying crooks to run your sport's not going to be run very well. So there you go. I mean, you stop paying them, they cease to exist, and then you have to somehow, boxing has to get its stuff together and get someone to run the sport well, whether it's an organization, whether it's some sort of, who knows what it is. Maybe it's at one point it kind of looked like PBC was kind of going that direction. Hey, I would be for it. I would be for it. The sport needs to be cleaned up however way it can be cleaned up. And you can't, obviously these organizations aren't trustworthy.
Matt, is it the fighters' fault? I mean, we've seen it in NCAA where now they've gotten together and college athletes are looking to get paid. We've seen in the past where, MLB, NBA, there's lockouts. Can the fighters get together and say, we're not going to pay these sanctioning bodies? We're not going to pay.
Yes, because the fighters are the ones that are paying. That money's coming directly out of their pockets. So the fighters need to be educated in that, hey, you don't have to pay that. Well, I mean, in today's current structure, they do have to pay it or else they're going to lose their belt, right? They put their blood, sweat, and tears into that belt.
And that's
right?
the dilemma, right? Is the fighters
who are up
here, they don't need the belts, but the fighters who are here trying to get a top 15 ranking, those guys see that as their pass forward, and they're not wrong. Like a Michael Fox. Exactly.
Michael Fox. That's right. They've worked their entire lives to get to this point. They don't want to not get to this point by not paying, some fee, right? I mean, they're there. They want to pay it. And that's the dilemma. We need to convince them that it's not to pay it. So how do you do that? I don't know.
Once we're in charge, we'll figure it out.
Exactly.
We will.
And
next meeting is when? You tell me when.
Yeah, exactly.
And we got to start wrapping up. But yeah, the next meeting could be definitely at a restaurant, and we're eating some Italian food, Mexican food, Cuban food, whatever.
Yes, please.
I'm down. But before we go, one last question for all of you. Has to be a short answer because we could talk a whole other hour about this. But this Sunday night, we got Jake Paul fighting Tyron Woodley. Whether we like it, we don't like it, it's gonna be an event that's gonna be watched. It's gonna be in Cleveland. It's gonna be the biggest show in Cleveland since LeBron James, I guess, maybe. But
just a kid from Akron.
Jake Paul against Tyron Woodley. I'll start with Matt. I'll ask you, Jake Paul, Woodley, or who cares? What's your prediction?
I'll go with Jake Paul. I mean, he seems to be fairly kind of strong and athletic, and I think he for a novice, he's all right. Despite my earlier comments, I don't necessarily have anything against these types of things. It's supply and demand. People are paying for it. Absolutely. They want to see it. Hey, have at it. I mean, it doesn't bother me. I won't buy it, but I mean, I'm not offended by it. But the boxing purist in me is not offended by it. Boxing boxing does that to itself with like the
Exactly.
WBA and WBC. So
And I know this is the first time you're on with us, but this is something we discuss like a lot. You know, Jake Paul is the least of boxing's problems.
Yeah.
What we just spoke about
No
for a
doubt.
good 20 minutes, the WBA
Yep.
is a bigger issue. But Victor, who do you like in this fight?
I like Jake Paul, and I think it's going to be Ben Askren all over again. I haven't been able to get to the bottom of it, but I got some information today that Tyron Woodley has not been training, and everything you've seen on Access on Showtime, it's all PR stunts from the Mayweather side, and that he's not taking this fight seriously. And Jake Paul has been training with Amanda down in Puerto Rico and Cleveland, a woman's champion, and
One of the greatest.
One of the greatest,
Yeah.
and they take this seriously. For as much as they like to, you know, with their shenanigans on YouTube and social media, they have taken this seriously, and that's what caught my attention. That they're not just looking to go out there and make a quick buck. They're serious about their training. I've seen them train. I've been to their training camps. And if you're just gonna step up and show up that night and say, because I used to do this for a living, I'm gonna take care of business. I don't. And Tyron Woodley hasn't had the greatest ending to his career in the octagon. You know, we saw a guy who at one point was dominant, and then it seems like the same thing that happened to Manny Pacquiao happened to Woodley while the time came calling. And I like Jake Paul's chances in this fight with that right hand of his.
David?
Same. And the thing is, Tyron Woodley was, I didn't know what Victor has heard. I think Tyron Woodley was going to lose this fight if he had trained his ass off. He's not he's a better stand-up fighter than Ben Askren certainly is. But Teddy Atlas, I think, nailed the analysis, which is he's a guy who comes straight forward. He doesn't really extend on his jab hand a lot, which is tailor-made for the one punch Jake Paul has mastered, which is his overhand right. And he has the power and the size advantage and the youth over a guy who's not taking it seriously. I think Jake Paul is going to take him out inside 2 rounds, and that's not an indictment on Tyron Woodley as a fighter. He's just never been a boxer, and he's also 39 years old with 4 consecutive losses in his last fights. The thing that I'm actually pretty intrigued by is I think there's some good showcase fights, or rather showcase fighters on the undercard. Amanda Serrano was called out. I'm super psyched for the class of women's boxing, maybe the most consistent. She maybe hasn't reached the peak that a lot of others had, but she deserves a payday like the one she's getting on this undercard. You also have Tommy Fury, who I'm not going to lose any sleep over as a fighter, but is interesting because he's got, some social media clout and potentially is a good opponent for Jake Paul in the future. You also had the return of Daniel Dubois and Ivan Baranchyk on the undercard too, and he's fighting a guy named.
Is Cepeda going to be there? Or?
Oh, man, neither of those guys have been or ever will be the same after that fight, and we're grateful for what they sacrificed in order to get there. But so I think it'll be a good night of boxing, and I'm excited to see Jake Paul bring eyeballs to credible fighters along with himself, because I think he's a credible fighter too.
I think we're all going to get told off on social media by some people, but four for four. Jake Paul. I think Jake Paul wins by knockout. Wow. Jake Paul's training in boxing.
Hey, bring it on. Bring it on.
Jake Paul's training in boxing, kind of like Matt showed there. Tyron Woodley's a UFC fighter. He's a ground and pound guy. You can't ground and pound in boxing. He had good hands, or has good hands, right? But UFC is one thing. Jake Paul's training in boxing. I do think he's a guy that talks a lot of trash. I mean, boxing isn't immune to that, right? We've seen lots through the years. The guy saying, this generation had Ali, Tyson, and now they have Jake Paul.
He knows exactly what he's doing.
He knows exactly what he's doing. I think he's going to win by knockout. I think he's training. He's a bigger guy. There are divisions for that reason. It's not a mistake that he's fighting a guy that made his career at 170 and 185 in the UFC. So you have that. And again, our final PSA, and I'm glad Matt said that, right? That he's not offended by this, because the boxing world has had but for the people that
we had a guy who bit off someone's ear So I
I was
think
gonna
we're
say,
okay.
and sticking with Tuesday Night Fights, one of my favorite shows to watch, growing up with my late father. Um, we had Mark Gastineau fight Tim Doc Anderson. Look at Matt.
You're right.
And then Tim
Such a
Doc
You're
great
right.
Anderson.
fight.
Then Tim Doc Anderson
That-
murdered the promoter.
Oh
I mean,
my God. Yeah, that's
Elvis Parker, right? Was his name?
Yeah.
Elvis. Yeah, something. No.
I don't know if you guys know the story. So
Yeah,
Doc Anderson
I
beats
forgot.
Gastineau. And then they do the rematch, and Gastineau knocks out Tim Doc Anderson. Tim Doc Anderson says that he was drugged in that fight so he could lose to Gastineau. So he went and killed the promoter.
That's what happened. And I don't know if you guys ever saw Mark Gastineau fight. Did you guys ever see that?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
My favorite was when Alonzo Highsmith kicked his ass. That was
I'll
What
say
a
that
reference.
Jake Paul is Sugar Ray Robinson compared to that.
yes.
Oh, Sugar Ray Robinson.
I think that's
Absolutely.
exactly where the note that we need to end on. That is a perfect sign off note.
But Matt, thank you for being on with us. This was a lot of fun. Good
Sure was.
good discussions. And we'll be watching this Sunday night Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley. But until next time, and until we eat some tiramisu and some pasta, this has been Boxing During Dinner.
Thanks, guys.